I thought the other really interesting thing that this article goes into that probably is as deep in the weeds as we like to be is the discussion of FBO accounts, or for benefit of accounts, and how those accounts actually are kind of at the core of the potential problem of why fintech banking is really almost doomed, to in the future, because the regulation and compliance over those FBO accounts is potentially going to be the ultimate downfall. And why this is kind of important, right, is because in the banking world, there's the KYC, or know your customer process, right? Banks are supposed to know who they're doing business with. So that way they're not banking for criminal organizations. They're not participating in money laundering. Seems like a few banks still have a little bit of trouble with that. But essentially these fintech banking partners, right, they are holding and separating out balances for customers that they rapidly put through essentially a KYC process, or lack thereof a KYC process, and then they can commingle all of those funds in an FBO account. So the bank actually has no idea who that money belongs to, only the fintech provider does. And so at some stage, if anything bad happens, the bank is like, well, I don't really know what to do with all of this money. And so is there going to be stricter banking regulations coming from either, say, the Consumer Protection Bureau, especially in the relations of the Synapse, Yada of all bank issue, right, which is totally mentioned in this as well, is that eventually just going to kill the whole prospect?
Well, one thing that is...
I was going to say, if anything, it's going to definitely weed out some of the fintechs that aren't having the same, level of compliance standards. I also think it'll bring some of those in the market that might be smaller. It's going to probably tighten the belt on some, as the banks have to look at who they're partnering with.
But wouldn't it be, and what's interesting is, like, wouldn't the banks be in basically not compliant because they're not paying attention? They're keeping all of these FBOs and technically mingled together. So wouldn't it fall on the actual banks, because you guys are not being compliant, that are affecting the fintechs as well?
Well, that's basically, but I think what this author is saying is, like, the regulation is closing in on this, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and it's going to close into a point where it's just going to choke it out. And the banks aren't going to do that unless these fintech providers move and actually open individual accounts with that bank for those individual users. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you caught, like, the slight jab that the author took at potentially some VC funding, right? Which is, when capital was cheap, all of these fintechs basically blew up and survived because they had a lot of crowdfunding VC capital pouring in, but the actual money-making mechanisms and the actual maintenance aspect of it, right? When cash is cheap, they were able to kind of get over that gap. But as, monetary policy changed and that money dried up, they didn't really have a way of maintaining that banking as a service infrastructure without basically changing their whole fintech banking paradigm, which, the customers probably wouldn't want, right? Like, a lot of these fintech banking partners are, like, very targeted. Are you a socioeconomically challenged person who, is struggling to get a bank account, or doesn't have a lot of money to pay regular account fees or have all of these different fees that banks charge. And so, you signed up for this service to help you build up a checking and savings. Mm-hmm. But, if they would have charged you a $15 account fee on a monthly basis, you probably wouldn't have chosen them.
Correct. It's just it's very sad because you do have the customers that do not realize that they're not dealing with a FDIC actual bank. And so if anything could happen, just like what's going on now, customers are without their money. So and the customer's like, whose fault is it? It's your fault, fintech. And fintech is like, no, it's the bank's fault. It's like everybody is pointing a finger with each other. So I can see this as being, it's a downfall.
Well, and allow me to be highly problematic for about 2 seconds. I also think that, for the past few years, we've had a very aggressive consumer protection finance bureau. So, is that come January 2025, is the pressure of regulatory compliance then going to become more laxed? And depending on how monetary policy changes, right? We just had a Fed rate cut. The Fed is supposed to be independent, but that could honestly all change. And so while I think this article is prescient to the time that it was written, which was for a very particular administration in the US, does it hold true past January 2025 if the Fed is no longer independent and there is less aggressive consumer protection out of that bureau?